Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Security Repo podcast. You've heard Dwayne and I talk a lot about conferences on this podcast. We attend a lot of them, and maybe you've even seen us at a few. But there's one conference that we love to talk about, well, one series of conferences that we love to talk about called B-Sides. It started off in Las Vegas around Black Hat, but they're all over the world. And we're thrilled to have a really great guest with us that's involved in organizing that's helped responsible for the incredible community around that, which is Huxley Barbee. Now, Huxley is the lead organizer of B-Sides New York City and the security evangelist at RunZero. He has spent over 20 years as a software engineer and security consultant, previously working for Cisco, SparkPost, and Datadog. Huxley attended his first DefCon in 1999 and holds both CISSP and CISM certifications. Huxley, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm just curious, before we dive into the actual agenda, your thoughts on DefCon moving to the Las Vegas Convention Center this year, like getting not invited back to any of the casinos.
Oh, okay. Do we have time for a story?
We do. We have plenty of time.
So this was the late 90s, and I was at DefCon, and I remember I was at one of the sessions, but I think they stopped the session, or it was something else, but there was a guy who went by the name The Priest. I don't know if you remember him, but he came onto the stage and he basically berated the entire room, right? He's like, you apes. So basically, I think if I recall this one right, somebody poured cement down the toilets or something like that, right? So effectively, like, destroying property at the hotel that was, graciously hosting us. And so I feel like DefCon is no stranger to having to move venues due to various shenanigans. So as you because I had not heard this
is 4 days
new
ago.
event was okay. Yeah, no, I'm not surprised. I'm not that's happened. So, but the thing is, like, DefCon as a culture, like, it thrives wherever it might be. So whether it's Link Harris or the convention center, it's going to happen, and everybody who attends is going to have a good time.
I'm looking forward to it, but just thought I'd throw that out there, get us into it, because we want to talk to you about community, and that's a community that you are deeply involved in, and that's B-Sides. As you were introduced, you were leading the charge for the B-Sides NYC, New York City, for those might be international. But actually, I think everyone in the world would know NYC, wouldn't they? So can you just give us just a super quick high level of what that community is all about for people that might not have been to a B-Sides before?
Yeah. So, well, I'll talk about B-Sides in general. B-Sides is a framework for regional security hacker conferences throughout the world. And it bore out of this need for accessibility, or making hacking and cybersecurity accessible to more people, because not everybody can fly to Las Vegas. Not everybody can afford the tickets for DefCon, which is now, I think, like $400 something or something like that, right? Or if in Europe, I'm sure you would love to go to CCC, but that's not everybody can fly out to whatever city that might be in Germany that it's in. And so the B-Sides really came out of that, like the idea of, hey, let's make sure that folks throughout the world have these opportunities to participate in the larger cybersecurity conversation, the larger hacker conversation, where people can speak and learn and so on and so forth. And B-Sides New York City is essentially the New York chapter for that framework. For B-Sides New York City itself, the main principles that we have are technical and accessible and community. right? So we want to be a technical conference, right? And we are a technical conference, similar to DefCon and such, as opposed to like the more businessy security conferences that you see a lot of, RSA, Black Hat, Secure World, and so on and so forth. But it's also community driven, right? So you'll find that the topics that we discuss are very much driven by what the community wants, what the practitioners wants, as opposed to a showcase of all the new bells and whistles from a variety of vendors, right? It's really about what the practitioners are looking for, what they want to learn, what they want to share, and so on and so forth. And then finally, accessibility. And this varies among the different B-sides quite a lot, but one of the principles that we have is to try and make tickets as close to free as possible, or just free, right? So you might find that there are other conferences, B-sides even, who will charge, let's say, like $70 for tickets, right? Our last one was $15, and if you email us from a .edu address, we actually give you a free ticket. And instead of charging $15. So those are the three main principles for B-sides New York City.
Yeah, I love that, and I've anyone that's come to a B-sides, I think the first time you're there, it's always a little jarring, especially if you've been to RSA or Black Hat or some other vendor con. Then it's a very different experience. Before I just get into my next question, I just want to share one of my biggest experiences with B-sides. I'd been to B-sides San Francisco before, but I decided to volunteer at B-sides Las Vegas. And I was on the registration desk, and I was just chatting to the people on the rego desk with me, and as people were filing in. And out of the 4 people that were on the registration desk, 2 of them were CISOs of Fortune 500 companies. And I couldn't believe it. And I was like, what are you guys doing here? And they'll say, well, this was the first conference that I ever spoke at. This was the first conference that I ever gave a workshop or had my first capture the flag or something, so that they come back and they volunteer here. And it's like a hack for life. These are people that you could never get access to ask questions, to learn from, and they're often these are the type of people that are there because the B-sides, the community is such a focus of it.
It's a very egalitarian channel for exchange of information, and you're talking about these CISOs. So there's one particular very famous cybersecurity influencer. I'm not going to name drop, so I won't mention his name, but I found out that he got his start. I mean, this guy has like hundreds of thousands of followers on YouTube and LinkedIn. He got his start in cybersecurity at B-sides New York City in 2016. So, 7 years ago. So that's pretty amazing to see, like his exponential growth in the industry. But it's got to start right at B-sides New York City. The other thing I want to mention is, you said there are these 2 CISOs there at the registration desk. You probably didn't know that they were they. And, one of the things about a community-driven conference in cybersecurity is we emphasize and we pay a lot of attention to privacy and things like this. And so none of the B-sides, as far as I know, collect any sort of PII about folks, right? At most, like, what is the email address so we can send you your ticket, right? But we don't collect any PII. So and that is part and parcel of like that hacker culture, that cybersecurity practitioner culture. Which I'll just say one thing here: vendors who are sponsoring B-sides, if they have marketers who are unfamiliar with the security industry, they're sort of taken aback by the fact that we don't have any PII to share with them. Like, they're looking for leads, and like, we don't have that. Like, we don't even collect it to give it to you. So if you're sponsoring to be in the mix, having these intimate conversations with security practitioners who may be CISOs, right? You just don't necessarily know that. But it's something. So for any sort of marketers or vendors that are listening out here, like, it's a different type of venue, but there's definitely return on investment for you sponsoring our type of community conferences.
I love the fact that it's not quite anonymous, but it's not, hey, I'll network and give me a scan on my badge. I've gone to a lot of conferences in my life, and that was It did take me aback when I first did my first B-sides, but now I'm like really dig it. Actually, though I like to opt in to tell people my name, so I started carrying around name tags on my own. So if you ever see me at a B-sides and you want to have a name tag, I probably have one in my bag. So feel free to come up and talk to me. I want to get back to talking about you though, and your involvement with New York City. So how
Right.
did you get involved in organizing it? Like I assume you like went as an attendee at one point and then transitioned over to being an organizer.
Yeah. So what's interesting is I'm not one of the founders for B-Sides New York City. There was B-Sides New York City 2016 and then 2018, and then the conference just went away. Right. 2019. Right. We all know what happened with the pandemic, and like just the whole thing went away. And then over the course of the next 4 years, there just wasn't that sort of momentum to do it again. And I think some of the founders actually moved out to New Jersey, which is fine. But their lives evolved through the pandemic and beyond, and so the conference just sort of wasn't really happening there anymore. And there are other conferences in New York City, but they don't necessarily have the same three principles that we do, right? They might be technical, but they charge, or they might be technical, but it's very, very small. Like space is a very, very scarce commodity in New York. So they might be a small conference that has like maybe like 200 or 300 people that attend, or it might be something that's biannual or something like that. So I really thought it was important to have a conference that was community based and technical and accessible. And so I just sort of just asked the question, hey, when is B-Sides coming back? Who's in charge of it? And I got to talking with the founders, and they were willing to let somebody else take the reins. Right. So, kudos to them. And they're still involved, of course. They decided to step back, but they're very much supportive of the conference, and they jump in to help out wherever they can. One of them is actually the finance officer right now for the nonprofit. So they're still involved. They just weren't able to, lead the conference like they had in the past. But I realized how important this was, especially in a cosmopolitan city like New York. I said, we need to have this come back. And I just jumped into it. That's it. So I think around May of 2022 or something like that, I decided to take the reins. I talked to my wife first, decided to take the reins. And, a year later, April 2023, we did it. We brought back the conference in spite of all the hurdles and challenges. We threw a conference, and we had more check-ins, more attendees than the 2018 conference. We had more CFP submissions than the 2018 conference. So in some ways, it was actually more successful than the pre-pandemic iteration of the conference, even though this was actually a reboot, and we were doing things by duct tape.
Well, conferences are incredibly complicated. I've been involved in meetups, not conferences, meetups, and that stressed me out to beyond belief. But how did you go about it? Can you take us behind the curtain of what actually goes into setting up one of these B-sides? Because I probably imagine that you would have thought, hey, let's do this. And then perhaps maybe there were some moments where you regretted making that decision when you kind of figured out how challenging this was. But what actually goes into building one of these community-based conferences? How does it come together?
Right. Okay. This is going to be a non-exhaustive list, right? Because I don't keep all of it in my head. I have multiple spreadsheets that's tracking all of my. This is basically project management, right? But you need a venue, right? And whoever that venue is, you got to negotiate with them, like dates and so on and so forth. You need a date. You need a CFP selection committee for your CFP, right? Essentially, the CFP is the product that the conference is offering to the world. So you want to have a good CFP selection committee so that you have a good CFP, right? Or so you have good talks. You need to decide if you want to have just talks or talks plus workshops plus something else, right? And so those are different sort of requirements for space and so on and so forth. You need to decide if you're going to cater lunch or if somebody else is going to bring lunch in or something like that. You need to have social media accounts. You need to have a mailing list. You need to have a website. You need to operationalize your CFP either through something simple like a Google form or a I don't know what they call them, but like sessionized paper call. These are like two different SaaS platforms where you can like accept talks and so on and so forth. You need to be regularly posting on social media. You need to go out and get sponsors to pay for your conference. So that means you need to have a sponsorship prospectus. You need to have a bank account. And of course, underlying all this is you need a nonprofit or some sort of legal entity in order to process all that. So you need the bank account. You need to set up ACH. You need to set up Zelle and so on and so forth. You need to decide what you're going to offer for sponsorships. Are you going to have tables? Again, going back to the venue, do you have tables to sell to sponsors? And what are those sponsors going to be able to do? What aside from those tables, right? Will they be able to demo from their tables? Well, which means they need to make sure they have power at those tables. Are you going to allow them to sponsor lanyards and things like this? Badging is very important, right? Many conferences have very simple badges. Others have electronic badges or PCB badges, which makes the conference really, really cool. And then there's the talks. Once you have the talk submitted, you need to decide who's going to speak. And you got to talk to the speakers to make sure that they can get to your conference and so on and so forth. You need to collect their biographies to post on the website and so on and so forth. They may have special requirements for their talks. They might be doing a demo or they might be showing something physical, in which case you have to make sure that the venue can support that. Another thing I didn't mention is insurance. You need insurance for the venue. Many venues require this. And then aside from the talks, you're probably going to want to have CTFs, right? That's a very big part of our conferences. So who's going to run that CTF? Are you going to run that CTF, or are you going to find an outside organization for you to partner with to do that? So anyway, I could go on, but this is just like a taste of the things. I hadn't even mentioned like getting volunteers and things like this. Like volunteers are like crucial to running a conference. They're the backbone of everything that we do. So there's a lot of volunteer management that needs to happen. And so anyway, there's a lot here. If anybody wants to have a more in-depth conversation about running a conference, let me know. DM me, connect with me on the various social channels, and I'm happy to have a longer conversation with you about it.
It's the main reason why I asked too is that these things are, sometimes I think people can take a little bit for granted, especially when B-Sides make such an effort to make things cheap and, or free. And then some people they get their tickets and they don't show because a better option comes up and all of this. But so much planning goes into this. And B-Sides is strange because it feels organic. It feels like a community. It can feel like a bunch of people just decided to get together, put on some talks and get pizza for lunch. But and it's really hard to make it feel like that. If that's the goal, that's harder than making it feel like a corporate conference. So were you aware? Did you have a moment when you were taking over this? You said, "What on earth have I done?"
Well, so odd fact about me. My wife did not plan our wedding. I planned the wedding. So all she did was pick out the dress, and then I took care of everything else. Which is also a one-day event. Although it happens once in a lifetime. I think organizing the conference was more complex than organizing my wedding. However, organizing my wedding was more stressful than organizing the conference because, I got one shot at the wedding, whereas, if you kind of screw up the conference a little bit, next year you can fix it.
Oh, and it's not just that. It's like the volunteer part as well. Like you yourself are a volunteer. This isn't like a
Yes.
paid position.
Nope.
You are a volunteer, and I don't undersell that. I've helped organize conferences multiple times in my life, and just the amount of extra work that goes into that. But you also have that support network. Like, you're not throwing B-sides by yourself.
No.
Um, there's a whole team helping you out, and that I've seen it happen so many times where people are like, "How can I?" They'll show up and be like, "How can I help?" And those people, the number of them, go on to become organizers in later years. So I think I totally see what you're saying. Like, the stress of your wedding, like, yeah, that's just you, like, you and your wife. That's the show. Uh, but no, I that's one of the things I love about the community. Is just everyone's always willing to step up. Like, you need an extra hand, you need somebody to pass out a paper, you need anything. That's just the spirit of what we do at these events. So if you're hearing
Yeah.
this and you haven't been to a B-sides yet, this is a giant sales pitch for you. Come on out. All we're selling you is a better community.
Yeah. And it'll be fun. It'll be fun.
I have a question there too, because one of the great things about B-sides is it's an opportunity for you to speak. And you mentioned before about this influencer or cybersecurity professional that's quite a big deal now, that's got their start at B-sides, and that's where a lot of people first start to speak, and they get up and they learn from each other. I can't remember how many CFPs that or call for papers. That's what that means. Is what I've submitted over the last few years. But you must have had a look at this. Can you maybe give some advice to people looking to come on to speak at, like, what if they're wanting to speak at a B-sides, if they're wanting to speak at a conference, what are you looking for? Do you have advice for someone that's making maybe their first submission, or even to me that's making probably their 200th submission? Any advice of how to make that appealing and what you're actually looking for?
Yeah, this is actually a pretty large topic, and we can do a whole episode just on that. So I'll keep it brief. I think the number one thing is to make sure that your title and your abstract makes sense. And I am not kidding. Like,
I know you're not kidding. I've done CFP.
I've seen really cryptic abstracts that where, like, I read it 5 times, I still have no idea what they're talking about. Like, and it has happened, and then obviously we don't select it, right? So what you should do is you should take, if this is your first time, take your abstract, take your title, and share it with some friends, and say, hey, what do you think? Because in your head it might make perfect sense. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, you're already way ahead of the game, because there are people who are not doing that. Like, you read their abstract 5 times and you don't know what they're talking about. Think about who's reading this, right? You have a selection committee that is reviewing tens, dozens, maybe even hundreds of these submissions. They're going to spend very little time looking at your abstract. So make sure it makes sense. And if you can't, make it catchy, but at the very least, just make it make sense. Share with somebody else, get their feedback, make sure you're providing the best abstract that you can.
I just have a one follow-up on that. And this is something I've been debating. How detailed do you want when you're making that decision? Like, if I build an outline that is literally every bullet point of the entire presentation, is that helpful, or is that information overload? Do you just want the catchy abstract that is like, I'd go to that talk?
So, yeah, I don't know about like the RSA and the Black Hat submissions, but like for many of these community conferences, I'm sure for many of these community conferences, like, you're not allowed to put more than 300 or 500 words anyway, or characters. So it's not as if you have an opportunity to provide a detailed outline. Some do allow you to do that, in which case, like, outline is fine. Like, nobody needs to review your slides or anything like that ahead of time.
All right. Just throwing it out there, because I think that's an intimidating thing for first-time speakers. It's like, well, I haven't written the talk yet. I don't have all my bullet points. I don't have all the slides done before I submit the CFP. Like, no, you have a really good talk idea. You just told me your talk idea, and it's great. You should submit that. So I'd encourage anybody out there, if you have a talk in your head, just write up an abstract and get talking.
Yeah, and if you're you're hesitant, start with a regional conference. Like don't go to DefCon on day one.
I mean, look, you know what? If you got into DefCon on day one, like I've been trying for a long time. I'll be, you know what? My hat to you. Go for it.
Hey, thanks very much for talking to us about this B-sides, about B-sides and community. We could talk about community literally all day, but we also wanted to talk to you because you are also, as we read your intro, you've been in the security space for a while now, and you've been working on getting this idea of exposure management popularized out there in a wider conversation in the community. For those of us who have never heard this term before, or those in the audience, I should say, what is exposure management? Can you just give us like the 10,000 foot view and like why you're promoting this?
Yeah. So I think for many folks, when they think about exposure, their mind immediately goes to vulnerability management, and more specifically vulnerability scanning, right? And that's traditionally what we all think of, and it's probably a good starting point for protecting your organization. Like beyond the basics of like we got EDR on our endpoints, and we got a firewall, and there's employee awareness training, and we got a spam filter and good backups, right? Those are all very important. Like the next thing that people do are probably like they get a SIM and they do vulnerability scanning. And so it's a very good starting point, but it doesn't necessarily capture everything in terms of what you want to see in terms of like full exposure management, right? What you really want to do is to understand all the different attack vectors into your organization, right? So the sum total of that, being your attack surface and so on and so forth, and then managing your exposures on that attack surface. And you might have more than one attack surface. You might have an internal attack surface and your cloud attack surface and your external attack surface and so on and so forth. And so managing that exposure is very important. And vulnerability scanning is, in my opinion, just one component of what you should be doing. So vulnerability scanners, they typically go out there and find like here are these devices with these CVEs, right? And it's very is very deliberate, and it's also very manual in some sense, right? Obviously, it's a machine that's doing the scanning, but like they hit one device and check for this vulnerability and that vulnerability and so on and so forth. Like it's very iterative, very sequential, very just like a single threaded, if you will. And it's really just looking at those vulnerabilities that are attached to CVEs. There's a whole other class of badness that makes your exposure problematic, right? For example, insecure configurations, right? These are the type of vulnerabilities that don't come from vendors and insecure code, but like you did this, you misconfigured this firewall, or you misconfigured this particular service to allow too many privileges, right? I just recently was commenting on this on Print Nightmare, right? The Print Nightmare vulnerabilities, and how even though Microsoft has addressed all of these vulnerabilities, the configuration in the group policy is so convoluted that, and also causes some user experience issues, that many organizations will simply disable that setting that prevents Print Nightmare, right? Or folks like the very common one is folks like giving public access to their S3 buckets in the cloud, right? These are misconfigurations or insecure configurations, and that's part of your exposure, right? The adversary doesn't care that, oh, there's a CVE attached to this vulnerability that I'm exploiting versus not, right? They're just going to exploit whatever they can. And insecure configurations sort of don't get the attention that it deserves. It's like the forgotten younger sibling standing next to vendor-borne vulnerabilities, because they don't really make the news as much, right? We have vulnerabilities with all these catchy names that go viral in the news, like this is the new O-Day and all that stuff. But like in terms of like fixing your insecure configurations, right? So cyber hygiene, like that's just forgotten about. And there's two other things I want to share about exposure management, is that there are advanced techniques that you can use to help understand your exposure. But I'll pause there if you have any comments on what I just said.
I mean, it's just an interesting thing. Like managing, it's the classic problem in security is managing what I think is my attack surface, what I think is my external attack surface, but it's what I think it is. It's just everything's an attack surface. Like somebody was talking about this, I think on a previous episode, about protect surface. Stop thinking about attack and start thinking protect surfaces. But even that, it just changes a word, but it's still the same problem set. It's all one of the hard fundamental problems that we're facing here. But that's all my comment on it. It's yeah, to Mac's point, like, yeah, what do we do about this, Mac?
Yeah, so there's some advanced techniques that can really help with this. So one is using details about devices as proxy indicators to uncover if they are potentially vulnerable to a certain vulnerability, which is possible. So, for example, right, to determine whether or not a particular endpoint has the move it vulnerability, you don't actually necessarily need to take a vuln scanner and run a security probe against that device and essentially like understand the exploit and say, aha, like I have verified with 100% confidence that there's move it on this particular endpoint. Rather, what you can do is use a proxy indicator, basically asset details. And asset details could include the hardware, the software, the security controls that are on that device, the services, what's listing on those ports, who owns the device, and so on and so forth, in order to say, aha, with a high degree of confidence, I can say that this device has the move it vulnerability. And you can do so easily if you have a comprehensive asset inventory that underlies your security program. And if you have that asset inventory ready to go, you can actually make this determination based on proxy indicators without having to do a rescan of the network. So rather than you having to wait for a new vuln check from the vuln scan vendor and then waiting for the next window where you can actually run a vuln scan and then run that vuln scan on your network, which could take weeks maybe, you can immediately search your asset inventory for those proxy indicators and then determine, hey, these are the 5, 10, 25 devices that probably have move it on it. So I should go and remediate that right now, all without a rescan. So that's number one. That's advanced technique number one. And then number two is outlier analysis. So something that we learned at my company, RunZero, is there's a high degree of correlation between outlier endpoints, I should say, and risky, vulnerable endpoints. So what by outliers, I mean the type of device that you have just one of or a few of, right? So not your standard issue laptop that is covered by your security program, covered by your business continuity program that already has like EDR on it, that's already being vuln scanned, that already has like all the controls that it needs. I'm talking about like that weird server that's been sitting in the corner and it used to be managed by Joe, but Joe left the company 5 years ago and we're not really sure what's on it, but we're not going to unplug it because who knows, it's probably doing something really important for the company. Or somebody brought in a Raspberry Pi and plugged it into the network and didn't tell anybody. Or somebody spun up a weird VM because they were doing some development and didn't tell anybody. Like those one-off, those outliers. And what we found in our analysis is a high degree of correlation between outliers, like that being an outlier, and that being a super vulnerable device or a very risky device. Because that device is going to be the one that's not patched, doesn't have security controls, didn't have proper security governance, and is essentially a gravity well for the adversary, right? Because if you're an attacker, you're going to look for the easy thing to do. You're not going to go for the laptop that has all the security controls on it. You're going to go for the thing that everybody's forgotten about, and then use that as like a forward operating position to then scope out what else you can do on this particular network. So two advanced techniques for exposure management that go beyond vuln scanning that I think is worth sharing with the world.
Interesting. Plugging in a Pi. That's the taking a Pi to work and just plugging it in, because it's not. Those are hacking. Those are devices meant to tinker with. You're supposed to have all the ports open. You do not have any kind of restrictions on what you can do on a Pi, but that's the point of a Pi. Yeah, you can harden it. You can, I guess, you could put security stuff on a Pi for experimentation, but I hadn't even thought about that, to be honest with you.
Well, I was just going to say this reminds me of a great story because of of talking about devices connected to the network of a navy in an will remain unnamed country, but not the states. But a navy was hacked, and why and how was the navy hacked? Well, some of the sailors or the journeymen had smart connected sex toys on on their things that were connected to the network. The hackers managed to use that as an entry point into the network because they were using these unsecure smart sex toys.
I can imagine when this episode publishes, there's going to be an uptick in search Google searches for that particular incident. This is better than the fish tank. Remember the fish tank in the casino? Yeah, this is better than that.
Yeah.
So my question was, that's all well and good for looking for device and endpoint, but we live in a cloud connected world. Like, I can connect to a lot of services on a random device that you've never heard of. Like, get into your network, sure, that's going to be the issue, but like, how are you accounting for, how does that play into it? Like the fact that
this is why having a comprehensive asset inventory is the bedrock of any security program and fundamental to you having an effective exposure management program. It's very hard to do exposure management well unless you've already solved the asset discovery problem beforehand. You need to have that and then build exposure management on top of it. Like, security visibility is always step number one. And then on top of that, you figure out like what your exposure. So basically, you got to know what you have first, and then two, know what's bad on the network. Yeah. And that's the order of operations. And I personally don't see another way around that.
We are coming to the end of the episode here, and we want to be conscious of your time. But we do like to play a game with everyone that comes on board. The game is called Best and Worst, and we want to ask you, what is the best security advice that you would give someone, or maybe someone has given you? And then I want to flip that on its head and ask you, what's the worst security advice that you've been given, or maybe you've given someone, or that you've heard? But let's start with the best. What's the best security advice that you would give the listeners if you could get people to take away one little tidbit?
I hate to say it, but the best advice is to unplug. Right? I mean, you can't get more secure than that. The worst advice is don't worry about it. I've heard that a lot too. Right?
That's the second time that's been the worst advice this week on recording.
Is that right? Yes. Yeah. Don't worry about it. Another good advice is whatever, you can try your hardest, but at some point, one of the users on your network is going to find a way to screw it all up for you. Like it's a hard thing to say, but our users tend to be the weakest link in any sort of security program or a security initiative. And as much as you try with employee awareness, that somebody is going to click on something they're not supposed to. And so it's always to keep that context in mind, that you try your best, you do what you can, but at the end of the day, something bad's going to happen, and you just deal with it as it comes, and don't lose too much sleep over it. And I think, given the amount of stress and burnout that we have in the security industry, maybe that is actually the best advice, is to not over stress about your responsibilities to the organization. Just do the best you can.
Yeah. I just went to a conference here in Chicago, Cybersecurity, and the running theme of the entire conference was risk and risk management, balancing it with the other priorities of the business. You mentioned on the printer earlier, the printer settings earlier, the printer config earlier. If you put too many obstacles in the user's way, they're going to end around and create a much bigger hole. So we got to find that balancing point of, I worry about it, but at the same time, we run with risk. We just being okay going home at the evening and being like, yeah, there's some threats.
Yeah. I don't mean to be complacent, but just take everything with a grain of salt. Yeah.
Be pragmatic.
Yeah. Well, it paralyzes you, right? When if you're too stressed about that, stress can be helpful, but it can also be unhelpful. And I think in security we can get a lot of the unhelpful kind, where a lot of it's kind of out of our control, and we need to take a deep breath. And we see this a lot. Like, we deal a lot in incidents that involve secrets, and then the knee-jerk reaction is always like, oh my god, delete the commit, rotate the secret, and then you crash production because you're just so stressed about everything, I think it totally makes sense that you need to take a moment and do it. Good advice. Well, Huxley, we've come to the end of the episode. I just want to thank you for coming here and joining with us. You did mention that if people wanted to have a conversation about conferences, to find you on social media, what's the best place for people to find you? And I'll make sure I have links in the show notes as well for anyone listening.
Sure. So I am on LinkedIn. Just search for Huxley Barbee. I'm the only Huxley Barbee you're ever going to meet. So that'll be easy. I'm also on Twitter. So it's at Huxley_Barbee. I'm also on the infosec.exchange Mastodon instance. So it's at Huxley. So you can find me in those. I'm inviting everybody in the audience to connect with me, please. I love having conversations with everybody from the industry. If you want to learn more about BSides New York City, it's just bsidesnyc.org. And if you're interested in learning more about comprehensive asset inventory and exposure management and want to try it out for yourself, you could go to my company's website. It's RunZero.com, RunZero.com. There's actually a free forever edition, community edition of the solution. You could download it without providing credit cards or anything like that. Just download it. You could run in your house and just check it out and see what it can find on your home network. You'll probably be surprised by what's there.
Awesome. Any final words, Dwayne, before we hit the big red button?
Just want to say thanks for being on the show, and I'm hoping to meet you in person in October, because October 19th, that's the next BSides in New York City, according to your website. So
that's right.
It's nyc.org. So check that out as well, and sign up for updates if you're in the New York area.